Marie Antoinette never said let them eat cake. Cleopatra wasn't just beautiful, she was a genius who spoke 9 languages. And that woman they called a deadly poisoner? She was actually spending her days writing poetry and funding hospitals. History hasn't just forgotten these women. It completely rewrote them. And today, we're setting the record straight. This is Crowned in History, and on this channel, we tell the stories of women that history tried to erase, simplify, or completely distort. Today's episode might make you angry. It might surprise you, but I promise, you'll never see these 5 women the same way again. Let's start with perhaps the most famously misunderstood woman in history. Close your eyes and think of Marie Antoinette. What do you see? Probably a woman in towering wigs and extravagant gowns, throwing parties while France starved. A queen so out of touch that when told the peasants had no bread, she supposedly replied, "Let them eat cake." For over 2 centuries, Marie Antoinette has been the ultimate symbol of royal excess and callous indifference. But here's the thing. She never said it. That quote? It appears nowhere in historical records during her lifetime. The phrase, "let them eat cake," was actually written by philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his autobiography, and he attributed it to a great princess. But he wrote this when Marie Antoinette was only 11 years old and still living in Austria. So where did this come from? Revolutionary propaganda. When you want to overthrow a monarchy, you need the people to hate the monarchy. And what better target than a foreign-born queen? Marie Antoinette was Austrian. In France, she was called L'Autrichienne, which sounds like Austrian woman but was also a play on words meaning the Austrian bitch. She was an outsider from day one, and when the revolution needed a villain, she was the perfect scapegoat. The real Marie Antoinette was complex, often naive, yes, but not the monster history painted. She was actually deeply charitable. Records show she regularly gave money to poor families, paid off the debts of struggling servants, and funded a home for unwed mothers. When a peasant was accidentally killed by one of the royal hunting parties, she insisted his family be compensated and personally ensured his children were educated. During the harsh winter of 1788, when France faced famine, she sold her own silverware to buy grain for distribution to the poor. Was she extravagant? Absolutely. Did she misunderstand the severity of France's economic crisis? Probably. But the image of a callous queen laughing at starving people? That was manufactured. Here's what really gets me. During her imprisonment before her execution, she wrote letters showing remarkable dignity and courage. She comforted her children, asked forgiveness from anyone she'd wronged, and faced the guillotine with such composure that even some of her enemies were moved. Marie Antoinette's story shows us how easily propaganda becomes history. Once a narrative takes hold, especially about a woman in power, it's almost impossible to shake. Even now, centuries later, that fake quote is the first thing people associate with her name. Cleopatra. The name alone conjures images, doesn't it? A seductress. A beauty who conquered the hearts of Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, using her feminine wiles to maintain power. Hollywood certainly thinks so. Elizabeth Taylor's Cleopatra is all smoldering eyes and revealing gowns. The message is clear. She was powerful because she was irresistible to men. But what if I told you that her beauty was probably average, and that calling her a seductress completely misses what made her actually extraordinary? Here's where it gets interesting. Most of what we know about Cleopatra was written by Romans, specifically, Romans who had every reason to diminish her. After her death, she became the enemy of Rome's first emperor, Augustus. He needed to justify why Rome had gone to war, why Mark Antony had betrayed Rome for Egypt. The solution? Paint Cleopatra as a dangerous foreign temptress who had bewitched good Roman men with her exotic sexuality. Roman historian Cassius Dio wrote that she was a woman of insatiable sexuality. But he was writing 200 years after her death, during a period when Rome was particularly obsessed with painting foreign queens as threats to masculine Roman virtue. Contemporary accounts from people who actually knew Cleopatra tell a different story. Plutarch, writing much closer to her time, said that her beauty was not incomparable, He said what was truly captivating about her was her intelligence, her charm, and, this is crucial, the sweetness of her voice and her persuasive conversation. Cleopatra spoke at least 9 languages fluently. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years to actually learn Egyptian. Her predecessors couldn't be bothered. She studied mathematics, philosophy, astronomy, and oration. When Julius Caesar arrived in Egypt, yes, she seduced him, but not with batting eyelashes. She had herself smuggled into his quarters wrapped in a carpet, emerging to present him with a bold political proposition. She understood Roman politics better than most Romans. She knew Caesar needed money and legitimacy for his campaigns, and she had both. With Mark Antony, ancient sources describe them holding drinking contests and philosophical debates. They founded a society called the Inimitable Livers, basically an intellectual drinking club. She wasn't just his lover. She was his political partner, military ally, and intellectual equal. Cleopatra ruled Egypt for 21 years during incredibly turbulent times. She stabilized the economy, navigated complex alliances, and commanded naval forces in battle. She was a politician, a scholar, and a strategist. Cleopatra's story shows us a pattern. When we can't diminish a woman's power, we sexualize it. If we can't erase her achievements, we attribute them to her body rather than her brain. The Real Cleopatra deserves to be remembered alongside Caesar and Alexander as a brilliant political mind. Instead, we remember her as the woman who seduced them. Lucrezia Borgia. Even the name sounds sinister, doesn't it? For centuries, she's been portrayed as one of history's most notorious poisoners, a beautiful, deadly woman who allegedly murdered rivals and enemies with a ring that dispensed poison, who may have committed incest with her father and brother, and who was the most wicked woman in Renaissance Italy. Victor Hugo called her a poisoner, a creature of lust. Countless novels and plays have featured her as a femme fatale, dripping with poison and depravity. But what if almost none of that is true? The Borgia family had enemies. Lots of them. Lucrezia's father was Pope Alexander VI, one of the most controversial and politically ruthless popes in history. Her brother Cesare was a military commander who conquered territories across Italy through any means necessary. The Borgias were Spanish in Italian territory, which already made them outsiders. They were ambitious, political, and yes, sometimes brutal. When you have that many enemies, those enemies write your history. After the Borgias fell from power, their rivals spread every rumor they could. The stories about Lucrezia, the poison ring, the incest, the murders, appeared in newsletters and gossip sheets written by people who had never met her and had every reason to destroy her reputation. And here's the really insidious part. There's a sexist pattern in how these rumors work. Cesare Borgia's violence? That was just politics. But Lucrezia? She must have been secretly controlling everything through feminine deception and poison. Letters and accounts from people who actually knew Lucrezia paint a completely different picture. She was highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, and a patron of the arts and education. When she married Alfonso d'Este and moved to Ferrara, she transformed the court into a cultural center. She funded artists, poets, and scholars. Pietro Bembo, one of the greatest writers of the Renaissance, exchanged passionate letters with her about poetry and philosophy. Contemporary descriptions call her charming, kind, and deeply religious. When her husband was away, she often served as regent, handling diplomatic matters and administrative duties with skill. The Venetian ambassador wrote that she was a most sensible and lovely, and also an exceedingly gracious lady. The poet Ariosto praised her generosity and intelligence. There's no historical evidence she ever poisoned anyone. No poison ring has ever been found. The incest accusations? They appear only in anonymous newsletters and the writings of her family's political enemies, never in any official document or verified account. What we do have evidence of is a woman who was used as a political pawn her entire life. She was married 3 times before age 21, each marriage a political alliance arranged by her father. Her second husband was murdered, probably by her brother, and she had no say in any of it. Lucrezia Borgia's story shows us how easily women get blamed for men's violence. Her father and brother were ruthless political operators, but somehow she became the poisoner, the seductress, the evil manipulator. It's easier to believe in a wicked woman than a helpless one. And it's easier to villainize a woman than to see her as a victim of her circumstances who still managed to create something beautiful. Mata Hari. The name is synonymous with spy, the ultimate femme fatale, the exotic dancer who seduced military officers across Europe and sold their secrets to the Germans during World War I. She was executed by firing squad in 1917 after being convicted of espionage. Stories say she blew a kiss to her executioners, that she was responsible for the deaths of thousands of Allied soldiers, that she was one of the most dangerous spies in history. But what if Mata Hari was barely a spy at all? What if she was actually just a scapegoat? By 1917, France was losing World War I. The army had mutinied, morale was collapsing, and the public was demanding answers. Who was to blame for all these losses? French intelligence needed a win. They needed to show the public they were catching spies protecting France. And Mata Hari, a Dutch woman living in Paris, exotic dancer, courtesan to military officers, was the perfect target. She was foreign. She was sexually liberated. She moved between countries. She knew officers on both sides. In other words, she looked like what people thought a spy should look like. The French press had a field day. They called her the greatest woman spy of the century. After her execution, the legend only grew. Margarethe Zell was born in the Netherlands. After a disastrous marriage and the tragic death of her children, she reinvented herself in Paris as Mata Hari, an exotic dancer. She was successful, famous, and yes, she had relationships with military officers. But here's what the evidence actually shows. She was arrested in 1917 and charged with being a German spy under the codename H-21. During her trial, the prosecution couldn't produce a single concrete piece of evidence. No intercepted messages. No dead drops. No verified intelligence she'd passed. The case rested mostly on the fact that she'd accepted money from a German attaché, which she claimed was payment for expenses after agreeing to spy for France, not Germany. Modern historians who've examined the files believe she was probably doing small favors for both sides, sharing gossip, nothing significant. She was what intelligence services call a low-level asset, someone who's more trouble than they're worth. The military tribunal that convicted her was held in secret. She wasn't allowed to see the evidence against her. Her lawyer wasn't allowed to cross-examine witnesses. When the full files were finally released in the 1980s, historians found something stunning. French intelligence had likely known she wasn't a significant spy. But they needed a propaganda victory, and her execution would serve that purpose. On the morning of her execution, she refused a blindfold. According to witnesses, she remained calm and dignified. One officer present later said, "She showed more courage than most of the men I've seen die." Mata Hari's story is about how women's sexuality makes them suspect. She wasn't convicted because of evidence. She was convicted because a woman who moved freely, who had many lovers, who didn't conform to expectations, seemed dangerous. She was probably guilty of being naive, of playing a game she didn't understand. But the master spy narrative? That was created because it was useful, because someone had to take the blame, and because a sexually liberated woman was easy to villainize. Wallis Simpson, the woman who destroyed a king. The story we've been told is simple. King Edward VIII of Britain was set to become one of the greatest monarchs in history. But then he met her, an American divorcee, manipulative and ambitious. She seduced him, convinced him to abandon his duty, and forced him to abdicate the throne for her. She's been called a Nazi sympathizer, a social climber, a cold-hearted schemer who destroyed the British monarchy's stability right before World War II. But what if Edward was already a problem long before Wallis came along? What if she was actually trying to get away from him? The British establishment needed someone to blame. They couldn't admit the truth, that their golden prince was a disaster waiting to happen. After the abdication, the royal family and government officials actively promoted the narrative that Wallis had bewitched Edward, that she was the villain. This protected the institution of the monarchy and, conveniently, protected Edward himself. Winston Churchill, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and Edward's own family all pushed this story. Better to blame an American outsider than admit they'd raised a king unfit to rule. Edward VIII wasn't a good man. Before he ever met Wallis, he was known for being vain, shallow, and uncommitted to royal duty. He'd had multiple affairs with married women. He complained constantly about his responsibilities. And here's what most people don't know. Edward was sympathetic to Nazi Germany. Trapped, that Edward's obsession with her was overwhelming. She wrote, "I am not flattered by his protestations of love, but rather feel sorry for him." In 1937, after his abdication, he and Wallis visited Hitler. Documents released decades later showed Edward had shared military intelligence with the Germans and hoped for a Nazi victory that might restore him to the throne. Wallis didn't make him a Nazi sympathizer. He already was one. As for their relationship, private letters show a different dynamic than the public story. Wallis wrote to friends expressing doubt, saying she felt trapped, that Edward's obsession with her was overwhelming. She wrote, "I am not flattered by his protestations of love, but rather feel sorry for him." There's evidence she tried to end the relationship multiple times. But Edward was the King of England. You couldn't just ghost him. He threatened to kill himself if she left. He had his household staff monitor her movements. One friend later said, "She never wanted the abdication. She was horrified by it." The real problem was that the British establishment knew Edward was unfit to rule, knew about his Nazi sympathies, but couldn't publicly admit it. So when he insisted on marrying Wallis, they saw an opportunity. Let him abdicate, blame the American woman, and put his more competent brother George on the throne. Wallis Simpson's story shows how women bear the blame for powerful men's failures. Edward was vain, reckless, and had authoritarian sympathies, but history remembers Wallis as the villain. She became useful twice. First, to remove an unsuitable king, and second, to preserve his reputation afterward. Instead of saying, Edward VIII was unfit to rule, history said, Wallis Simpson destroyed a great king. It's easier, it's cleaner, and it's completely unfair. 5 women. 5 complete rewrites of history. Marie Antoinette wasn't heartless. She was a propaganda target. Cleopatra wasn't just beautiful, she was brilliant. Lucrezia Borgia wasn't a poisoner, she was a scapegoat for her family's sins. Mata Hari wasn't a master spy, she was a convenient victim. Wallis Simpson didn't destroy a king, she was blamed for his failures. Here's what connects them. Every single one was easier to villainize than to understand. Every single one was blamed for men's violence, men's failures, or men's propaganda needs. History isn't just what happened. It's what the people in power decided to remember. And when those people had reason to hate, fear, or use these women, they rewrote them completely. So the next time you hear a story about a wicked woman from history, ask yourself, who told this story? What did they gain from telling it this way? And what might the truth actually be? Which of these surprised you most? Let me know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the real women behind the myths, subscribe because we're just getting started.